Conversations for the Cultured Intellectual, where we discuss various intellectual subjects that will impress your listeners and make you seem cultured and smart. I'm Katie Oppenheimer, and I, along with Lily Braden and Kiana Williams, will be hosting these daily episodes. Today we are also joined by special guest Gareth Hart, who is an expert in our topic of focus and will be helping us discuss and explore the fascinating topics of this week's series. This week, we will embark on a new journey, focusing on the evolution of economy. We begin the cycle with the conversation topic of economic change in the 18th century Europe, the economic transformation and geopolitical maneuvering brought on by increased colonization and the advent of global trade. Now, to dive into the captivating world of 18th century European economics.
To pursue any discussion of the functions and structure of 18th century European economics, one must look back in time to see the foundation from which the economy deviated. Therefore, we start the conversation by observing the economic state of European countries in the 17th century and earlier. Katie, would you like to explain further?
Well, prior to the 18th century, Europe was an agrarian society, with 80% of the population of Western European countries depending on agriculture to sustain themselves. The reliance on agriculture resulted in the economy being very limited.
During the Middle Ages, the Ottoman Empire controlled all trade routes from Europe to Asia and Africa. By the late Middle Ages, select Italian cities, including Venice and Genoa, established themselves as middlemen with the Ottoman Empire in Asian and African trade to fulfill the Europeans' great desire for silk, cotton, and spices.
You see, listeners, compared to the East, Europe had minimal resources to export. The wheat and chickens and such they could offer did not compare to the exotic spices and fantastic goods of Asia. Faced with the threat of an extremely powerful Ottoman Empire and cut off from the current trade routes to the riches of Asia, Europe explored different trade routes.
Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands were the main European countries that pursued new routes of trade in the Atlantic and Asia, motivated by God, gold, and glory.
Portugal was the first European country to launch explorations into the New World. They explored and established commercial settlements and plantations along the coast of Africa and its interior. They also settled in the Atlantic islands of Madeira and the Azores. The Portuguese settlements proved valuable with thriving sugar plantations, African slaves, and access to African gold. The early exploration and maritime prowess established themselves as a major global trading force. By 1500, Portugal controlled the flow of gold from Africa to Europe and had become the entrance port for Asian goods into Europe. At this point, we stop the program to thank our sponsors, including the Tuba Players Association, the Popcorn Guild, and listeners like you.
After Portugal proved that exploration and colonization of the New World was extremely lucrative, Spain launched its own exploits into the Americas with explorers such as the famous or infamous, whatever you believe, Christopher Columbus.
Like many historical figures, Christopher Columbus is the only Spanish explorer widely remembered, but in reality, he was only one of many conquistadors and explorers who ventured throughout the world, including Hernando Cortés and Francisco Pizarro. The Spanish were aggressive in their pursuits of wealth from gold and slaves, quickly forming multiple colonies in Mexico, the American islands, and the Philippines. The Philippines were a bridge between the Spanish Americas and China, and were therefore very useful in trade. In the colonies they formed, they established the encomienda system, a system whereby the Spanish crown granted the conquerors the right to forcibly employ groups of Indians. Slavery thinly disguised.
The Spanish amassed enormous wealth from the silver mined by indigenous peoples. The conquistadors divided the territory they claimed into 4 administrative divisions called viceroyalties, in which a viceroy would govern. The Spanish were also determined in their pursuit of spreading the Catholic faith to the New World, resulting in numerous missions being formed throughout their colonies. In the 17th century, the Netherlands challenged both Spain and Portugal in trading and colonizing the New World, and just as Spain had wrested dominance from Portugal, the Netherlands took control of global trade from Spain, and by the middle of the 17th century, the Netherlands was the most powerful worldwide seaborne trading power.
The foundation of the Dutch trading empire was spices from the East. They founded the Dutch East India Company to gain control of the trade of spices from Portugal. Through agreements and war, the Dutch gained control of the entire Indonesian archipelago. The question is, what happened to the other European countries? Lily, how would you explain this phenomenon?
Well, for many of the absent countries, it was because of geography. After all, geography is destiny. The countries didn't have good access to water routes. In other cases, like England, tumult prevented them from joining the exploration and colonization craze.
Talking about England, by the end of the 17th century, England had managed to establish colonies along the Atlantic coast from New England to Virginia. These colonies allowed England to take control of trade along the Atlantic coast.
More significantly, the English leadership was clever in their structuring of the economy and trade. In 1651, Oliver Cromwell established the Navigation Acts. These acts prohibited any imported goods from Europe to be transported on non-English boats or with non-English crews. These acts required colonists to ship the goods they created on English boats and to buy their goods almost expressly from England. The Navigation Acts succeeded in eliminating any foreign competition in the colonial markets. These laws were also seen as a form of economic warfare, first against the Netherlands, which was superior in trade in the early 17th century, but then fell behind due to the harmful impact of the acts, and then France.
The age of European exploration had linked countries throughout the globe through trade and colonization. In the 18th century, the global economy was further established. The 18th century saw great economic growth and unification, as well as conflict between countries that would decide which could claim the great wealth and power of overseas colonization and trade. The Netherlands, France, and Great Britain were the most prominent and successful players in the 18th century economy. Despite its slow start in the beginning of the expansion, England transformed itself and its economy the most of all the European countries in the 18th century, using trade to gain power, challenging France and European dominance, and establishing itself as a wealthy and influential country.
England began its dramatic change with the union of England and Scotland into a single country, forming Great Britain. Great Britain's success in the 18th century is largely tied to the establishment of the mercantile system of the Navigation Acts, which provided the kingdom with wealth and bolstered its military power, which in turn helped Great Britain in their competition with France for colonial empire.
It's good you bring that up, Lily, because the conflict between England and France was very intriguing, and the colonial wars were a major factor in the great change that occurred in the 18th century. The first of these conflicts was the War of Spanish Succession. The prospect of Spain and France uniting was threatening for Great Britain, as it would upset the balance of power in continental Europe and would certainly mean that their colonies in North America would be lost.
The Treaty of Utrecht concluded the war in favor of Britain, with the French giving them colonies of Newfoundland, Nova Scotia in the Hudson Bay Territory. Britain also secured the Asento, the West African slave trade.
The next important colonial war was the 7 Years' War. It was the most significant in the Anglo-French conflict and Britain's rise to power. With the concluding Treaty of Paris in 1763, France lost all of its colonial holdings in mainland North America, ceding all territory east of the Mississippi River to Britain. The French also left India, leaving the country open to British colonization. By the last colonial war, Britain had established itself as a vast trading and colonial empire.
With the new territory and wealth from the rapid growth of the shipping industry due to the Navigation Acts, London grew to be wealthiest and largest city in the West. England's continued economic success is due to the large colonial markets that made up for the decreased traditional European markets. By 1774, sales to North America, the West Indian Islands, West Africa, and Latin America had soared to £4 million.
Despite their losses to Britain, France still profited from the prolific colonial trade. The French colony of Saint-Domingue, what we know today as Haiti, was the world's leading producer of coffee and sugar, and the most profitable colony in the New World. France gathered enormous profits from plantation agriculture and slave trading in the late 18th century.
The Atlantic slave trade was a brutal and time-changing economic and political occurrence. The migration of millions of Africans was a driving force behind the economic expansion of the 18th century. The practice increased drastically after 1700 and especially 1750, when the growth of trade and demand for items that were slave-produced increased. Wars among African states increased, which led to the purchase of more firearms. In the late 1780s, the campaign to abolish British slave trade soared. In 1807, Parliament officially abolished slave trade. However, the slave trade continued to thrive. In Asia, the main focus for colonization in the 18th century was India, with British and French struggling for the control of the fertile colony. British and French forces in India supported opposing rulers in local power struggles. This struggle for power concluded with the Treaty of Paris, which granted all France's possessions in India to the British. With the elimination of their rival, Britain's ascendancy in India accelerated. By approximately 1805, the British had overcome vigorous Indian resistance to gain economic and political dominance of much of India.
Continuing their quest to expand their empire, the 18th century witnessed the British beginning to settle in Australia. This information regarding the change in the European economy that occurred in the 18th century is riveting, but some listeners may be wondering why it is important. Lily, how would you explain what the significance of the economic change is?
Well, one significant impact the change had was in the mixing of peoples and ideas and the consequent increased diversity that occurred with the European expansion and colonization. New ethnicities were formed as Europeans and the indigenous people mixed. One of those ethnicities is Creole, which were people of Spanish descent living in the Americas.
Colonial attempts to accept racial categories also greatly influenced Enlightenment thought on differences.
Another significant result of the economic change was that the colonies adopted new native foods and found remedies to tropical diseases.
The unification and development of trade to form a global economy was substantial progress towards the modern relationships between countries we know today. The global economies also meant more growth and innovation as thinking mixed and new ideas were formed. The global economy led to the Industrial Revolution as demand for products increased, which changed forever the structure and nature of the world. And with that, we bid our freshly educated listeners goodbye and good night.